We'll talk about this economy in just a moment. I think we need to follow on from the Federal Reserve and the news conference with Chairman Powell just yesterday. Stepping aside as the Fed chair, but staying on as a governor. Kevin, was anyone in the administration given a heads up ahead of time before you heard that announcement?
You know, communications with the Federal Reserve and the administration are still open when there are policy concerns, but I can't really discuss that. I can say that I'm disappointed in what Jay said, but I'm going to sort of stay out of it as we await just a couple weeks Kevin Warsh's confirmation. I think when Kevin gets in there, it's going to really be a sea change at the Fed that we're all looking forward to.
Kevin, in the meantime, the president has articulated his disappointment like you just have. Previously, the president suggested that if the chairman stayed on beyond his time, not sure what he meant specifically by beyond his time, that he would fire him. Is the president intervening certain options to intervene?
You know, I think that in the end, our hope is that Chairman Powell understands that the Justice Department has stood down. They've just asked the Inspector General at the Fed to look into this, which is something the Inspector General is probably doing anyway. And so that I think that it's time to de-escalate and move on.
Kevin, do you think the president has sufficiently de-escalated to allow him to move on?
Well, he doesn't think so, and I think that in the end he'll study the matter, and we hope he comes around.
The Treasury Secretary says it's an insult to the other Republican nominees on the board, the likes of Governor Waller, Mickey Bowman, people that you and I know fairly well. Do you believe it's also an insult, and does it complicate the way this particular institution will operate in the months and meetings to come?
Again, I don't want to start getting too much into having the White House argue with the Fed right now while we're waiting Kevin Warsh's confirmation, which looks like it's a lock to me. The bottom line is that Kevin Warsh is going to go in there. He's going to be new leadership. He's going to be fresh leadership. And we fully expect that that's going to help everybody see how important the independence of the Fed is. Now, as a logical matter, if you just sort of say, hey, we'd like the IG to look into something, the IG is the Federal Reserve's Inspector General. And so it's completely respectful of the independence of the Fed. We do respect the independence of the Fed, and I think that the best way to show that it's not a partisan organization is to move on.
There has been a pretty aggressive push to reduce interest rates. At the same time, this Federal Reserve is shifting towards articulating a more symmetrical reaction function. Not there yet, but getting closer to it, Kevin. Supporting that is the economic data from earlier on this morning. Do you think there is space just to wait, to see, to work out how things turn out before thinking about reducing interest rates?
Right. Well, first of all, let's talk about the economic data for a second, because it was just kind of a whole bunch of blockbuster numbers. The 2% number, actually, you know, for me, being capital spending guy, I used to be the capital spending guy at the Fed when I was a young economist. That the thing that was amazing, as you know, is, and you highlighted, the capital spending boom, and one of the things that sort of dragged it down from a really high number was that the quality of the imports has skyrocketed, and so almost half of the imports were capital goods, which were coming in to build factories in the U.S. Typically in the past, you know, our imports are things like consumer goods that are perishable. And so the bottom line is that it's really strong data. We got initial claims the lowest they've been since the 1960s. We got government employment the lowest it's been since the Second World War. We've got all these positive movements in terms of fiscal responsibility and economic growth moving forward. And so then, but we do have this temporary disruption with energy markets, which is very serious. As you mentioned, the energy prices are high, gasoline prices are high. But, you know, my read of the academic literature on what you do when you have an oil shock like this is not that you raise rates into it, especially given how I think we're highly confident that this is going to be a temporary disruption. Futures markets agree with that as well. And so I think it would be a policy error for, you know, this ECB or the Fed to hike rates into a temporary spike in energy prices. And their own economic studies sort of suggest this is true, because if you look at it, what they want to do is make sure that future inflation goes back towards the target. The best forecast of future inflation is not top-line inflation, but core inflation. And core inflation in the last CPI number was fine. The PC's kind of crept up a little bit, but it doesn't tell the story of the top line. And the top line is the kind of thing that I think someone could overreact to.
It might not be appropriate, Kevin, to have a rate hike at this point, but do you agree with your colleague, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who came out and said it might be appropriate to stay on hold for a while as this does progress and works itself out?
Again, I am highly confident that the productivity boom is going to keep core prices under control, and my old friend Alan Greenspan in the 90s saw that because of the computer revolution that we could have high growth and there wasn't a Phillips curve kind of thing that you needed to respond to, as he let us have 4 or 5 of the best economic years that we've seen in my lifetime. And I think that we have that opportunity again, and it would be a shame if we squandered it.
So you think that it is appropriate to currently cut rates, despite the increasing concern by some of the Fed members that we are entering a potentially inflationary moment? Do you think it's inappropriate to go to something more of a symmetric type of approach?
Well, they've been sort of saying we're leaning towards cutting, and then there was some dispute about what's going to happen at the next meeting. But I think that getting interest rates down could really supercharge the economy from where we are, but not be super inflationary. So you saw that the weak spot in the GDP report was residential investment, which was down 8%. Residential investment is kind of the most interest-sensitive thing there is, and I think that Fed policy has a chance of moving the yield curve in a way that could really help home buyers. And one of the things that I remember from the 90s is that when we want to have sort of low inflation, high growth, then one of the things that happens is you get a lot of construction, residential construction. And when you have residential construction, it has a big positive effect on GDP because you have like an empty house that has to get filled with a washer, dryer, and a TV, and carpet, and furniture, and everything else. And that's much different than if you have like an old house where you're moving from one old house to another. And so new construction is really the thing that could lift this to 4 or 5% growth, and it's being held back by high interest rates.
What's the pathway to get there, given the fact that the longer-term yield curve is seeing some of the highest rates that it has this cycle, 5% in the 30-year yesterday for the first time in a while? And frankly, a lot of people in the market think that if the interest rate were cut at the front end, that would only exacerbate the creep higher in yields at the long end. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, there are times when that's true, but not a time when we're in the middle of a huge positive supply shock. And so I think a little bit of movement, and Kevin Warsh, hopefully soon to be Chairman Warsh, has described how one can do that and maybe play with the balance sheet a little bit at the same time and move things in a direction that helps America's homeowners. And I think that if we could get that last little bit of the economy going on all cylinders, then we'd really, really be back very close to talking about the golden days.
Kevin, we have triple-digit crude this morning, WTI, much higher. And actually what you're seeing across America, especially in a place like California, they've actually breached $6 a gallon when it comes to gasoline. I know the White House has some measures. They've extended the Jones Act waiver. But what else are you thinking about?
Well, we've already done a whole bunch of things, including, basically opening up the drilling that was offshore drilling in California that was shut down by the state, and that's actually, alive and pumping out barrels. The bottom line is that we're very convinced that this is, a suicidal Iranian regime that was set on really big disruptive things in the region that would be perhaps permanently harmful, and that when we had them signal in their negotiations that they were just about ready to have 11 nuclear bombs, then the president decided to take action to defend the entire earth, for goodness sake. And so right now, the thing that I look at as in terms of the economic effects of the war is how difficult it is for Iranians right now, as if the government doesn't care about them at all. And so they're having a hyperinflation, they're running out of food, they don't have any distilled product to drive around in their cars, they're shutting down businesses, even the Persian rug dealers are shutting down. It's time for that government to just see that they shouldn't aspire to have a nuclear weapon, and if they just give that up, then we can go back to having normal relations, one could hope.
Right, but what could this government do to shield Americans from higher gasoline prices? Are things like an export ban on the table?
No, what we've done is we've, as you know, we've done the Jones Act. We've opened up drilling in California. We've, pursued changing the ethanol standards so that the corn ethanol can be used more in the summer. We've taken every single step that we can, and we understand that it would have been a lot worse if we hadn't done that. But the fact is that our expectation is that things are going to get better very, very quickly if we could just get the Iranians to finish the negotiations and realize that it's in the interest of their own people to stop things that could turn into serious hunger events and so on.
Kevin, unfortunately, and you and I are probably in agreement here, unfortunately they've got a track record of doing a lot of things that aren't in the interest of their own people. In the meantime, there seems to be a preference to maintain the blockade and put the squeeze on them. How close are we to them breaching storage capacity, so to speak? What's our understanding of that? Do we have a decent gauge of where things are at inside the country?
It's a well-to-well thing, but the basic idea is that if you shut down a well, then the pressure can build, and then the oil can kind of squirt everywhere, and then when you open the well up again, you get a lot less oil out of the well. That's the sort of theory of what could happen, and it's certainly possible because they're running out of storage that they're going to have to shut in wells. The one thing I can say is that their production went from 5 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day because of President Trump's policies in the previous term, when he really put in tough sanctions on Iran to try to stop the nuclear program. And after Joe Biden came in, he just stopped the sanctions, and the energy production went back up to 5 million barrels a day over a couple of years. And so the Iranians, it took them a couple of years to get things fixed, probably with new wells and so on, because it can harm wells. But we have an experience of them being shut almost down to nothing and then getting back up.
Kevin, are partners stepping up to help? We're just hearing from the president here out on social media, so I'm sure this is the first time you're hearing of it. I'll read it for you. The Chancellor of Germany should spend more time on ending the war with Russia and Ukraine and fixing its broken country, especially immigration and energy, and less time on interfering with those that are getting rid of the Iranian nuclear threat, thereby making the world, including Germany, a safer place. I believe the German Chancellor earlier this week suggested that the president was being humiliated by the Iranians. Just what is the relationship like, Kevin, with our European partners at the moment?
I think that the European partners are feeling stress because their very unwise energy policies have exposed them much more to energy shocks from the Middle East. And it looks like the German Chancellor is losing his cool a little bit. And I would suggest that, he take a deep breath and recognize that the best way for Europe to get its economy back on track is to, help us resolve this problem. And then also examine their own policies, which are so anti-free market that their economies are, happy when they get 1% growth. I think Germany's a great country. I lived there for a time, and I think there's a heck of a lot of potential for that country, but they sure aren't achieving it right now, and it's not just because of oil.